Hello, I'm Catherine Nicholson on France 24. You're watching Talking Europe. Now, in a time when there's renewed and passionate debate about the unequal treatment of people from ethnic minorities all around the world, we are today focusing on the issue of equality in the European Union. My guest in the programme today is EU Commissioner for Equality, a job that also covers gender equality, the rights of LGBTQ people and people with disabilities. Now, at her confirmation hearing for that job, she said that equality is not a zero-sum game. The empowerment of women and persons from minority backgrounds is of benefit to all. So, Helena Dalli, thank you very much for being our guest today.
Hi, thank you for inviting me.
Well, I'd like to start off with those protests and marches and rallies we've seen here in Europe, but of course inspired initially by news in the United States. Do you agree with protesters who say that Europe has been turning a blind eye to its own problems with racial inequality?
Well, ironically, we're speaking on this 20 years after the European Union introduced the Race Equality Directive, which goes to show that legislation is not enough on its own. So the fact that 20 years on we are still discussing this says a lot about what we have to do in order to change attitudes, to change cultures, to change the way we look at these realities, and that legislation on its own is not enough. And that is why we shall be coming out with an action plan to see how we can enforce the legislation and see that those who should be enforcing the legislation are actually doing that and not doing the opposite, as we have seen.
Now, the EU's Fundamental Rights Agency, it said recently that political hate speech against Muslims and refugees is now mainstream, in its opinion. This is an EU agency, as you know. Now, since 2015 and that huge spike in arrivals in the EU of irregular migrants, there's been a lot of hostility directed towards migrants and refugees from a lot of political leaders. And we've had, including, leaders of your own country, Malta, shutting their ports to ships carrying asylum seekers from Africa, people rescued in the Mediterranean. How much responsibility do political leaders share when they've talked tough about migrants and refugees in this way?
Okay, one of the values of the European Union is solidarity with others and solidarity within the member states. So we really should see that there is sharing in this reality, and that there is a dedicated asylum policy, so that we don't have to take ad hoc measures all the time.
But just specifically on the actions of not just Malta, also in Italy, we saw ports closed to migrant boats as well. Do you see a link between those actions and this increase, as the FRA has said, in mainstreaming political hate speech against refugees?
Yes, it's of the essence that we tackle discrimination in all of its forms, whether it's in the form of hate speech, whether it's in form of actions, whether it's in the labor market, whether it's in education. It is important that we must have as our benchmark to help to see that every person living in the European Union can reach his or her full potential.
It is actually quite hard to quantify racial discrimination specifically in Europe. The UK is the only EU area country, not even a member anymore, that actually does comprehensively collate anonymised information about ethnic origin of people, for example, applying for jobs and what have you. Now, the European Network Against Racism says that 65% of people from ethnic minorities are in favour of this kind of data being collected. Do you think that it should start to happen here in Europe?
Yes, we should have more desegregated data in the sense that there are the intersections, and therefore you must go specifically to certain areas and quantify those. Obviously, it will help in our work in order to address these situations. The more information you have, the more data you have, obviously, the better your policy formulation will be.
Well, work has already started on this. We know that the 2008 EU Equal Treatment Directive was put together. Now, that would expand protection throughout the EU against discrimination on grounds of age, disability, spiritual beliefs, sexual orientation. It sounds great, but it still hasn't been adopted. Your colleague Vera Jourova told the European Parliament recently that some EU countries are still blocking the adoption of this directive. Which countries?
Yes, that's correct. We are still in discussion with member states on this. Some are changing their positions, some aren't. So we can't take a snapshot and say these are against and here, because we are still in discussion. This is an old directive coming from 2008, and we need unanimity for this directive to
I'm just
come
thinking that people in those specific member states
So
might be interested in specific member states that are resisting adoption of this. I think people living in those member states who watch this interview might be interested to know whether their governments are resisting it, and they might want to have a say on that.
Yes, but that is all part of the process, because we don't only speak with the governments in member states. We speak with members of parliament. We speak with civil society, and that is how our dialogue is formulated, so that we don't only hear the reasons coming from the government, but also from MPs and from MPs who are in favor of the directive and from MPs who are against.
The Commission is still committed
and
to this
also
directive.
from civil societies.
Committed to this directive.
Yes, we are. I'm not saying that it is easy to reach unanimity, but we are still working on it, and we are still trying very hard to reach this goal.
Okay, another really important part of your work, I mentioned LGBTI equalities. It is Pride Month right now. A recent survey found that people who identify as LGBTI in Europe overall believe that their situation has got worse in Europe in the last decade. How do you want to respond to that?
Well, if you look at the FRA survey, there are some people in member states where they say that they have progressed, and there's data to show in terms of legislation, for instance, how they have progressed, and others which, as you rightly point out, which have regressed. So that is why the Commission at the end of this year we are working right now. It's in the consultation process. We are working on the first ever LGBTI plus strategy.
There are some specific policies in various member states that are of a concern. I'd just like to raise one with you. Around 100 municipalities in Poland that have declared themselves LGBT-free zones. That's their wording. Now, this appears to be a violation by Poland of very key parts of EU treaties. I know you've condemned these zones yourself. A letter has been sent from the Commission in early June. If these municipalities do not change these policies, should the Commission be withholding EU funding over this?
We are seeing how we can address this situation, but we have already said if the funds are being used in a way in line with this policy, yes, of course, this will have to be, these funds will have to be revisited. But there are other things which we are seeing too. For instance, when it comes to employment law, what happens to me if I'm LGBTI and I work in a shop which is in a LGBTI-free zone, so-called LGBTI-free zone. So it's an infringement on my rights as a worker, So we are putting all this together and analysing the situation, because this is unacceptable.
We've just got time for one last question. Ursula von der Leyen, the Commission President, set a target of having 50-50 male-female representation in the European Commission. In the end, because of some last-minute changes, you're one of 12 female commissioners. Why is it so hard, do you think, to achieve gender parity in these big, important institutions?
President von der Leyen did her utmost to have a 50-50, as you say, commission. But then there is so much that you can do, because the last word is of the member state. But I think that she said a very, very strong message when she set up a portfolio dedicated entirely to equality. This is the first time ever that the Commission has a portfolio dedicated solely to equality, and this shows her resolve to address this very big problem, whether we are speaking about gender equality, whether we are speaking about racial equality, whether we're speaking about LGBTI equality, disability equality. So there is so much that we have to do, and she is very much aware of this, and thus her decision to have a dedicated portfolio for equality.
All right, Helena Dalli, Equality Commissioner, thank you very much for being our guest today on Talking Europe.
Thank you.
And thanks to you as well. Do stay with us on Talking Europe. More European news coming up for you very soon.
Special event.
Join us for coverage of France's local elections. From our studios in Paris to key cities, we'll be bringing you the latest on how voting is getting underway.
This decisive second round was put on hold under France's COVID lockdown. Now voters can deliver their verdict.
Will President Macron's party be punished? Will Anne Hidalgo be able to hold on to the biggest prize, Paris City Hall? And will there be breakthroughs for the Greens and the far right?
It's a litmus test of the political landscape ahead of 2022's presidential election.
Join us for all the results, some ambience and some key analysis on why these elections are important in France. You won't want to miss it.
Watch events unfold on France 24 and France24.com.